All right, so this is chapter 2, and this chapter is going to talk about the sort of first encounters between the Americas, North America and South America, and the rest of the world as it was, and sort of look at how Atlantic trade sort of developed and what sort of things developed out of that as well, and how it kind of changed the way that the world worked, at least for that time. So, without further ado, we will start chapter 2. So, before the advent of Atlantic travel, the savanna, which separated the Sahara Desert from the southern part of Africa, played a major role in long distance trade between the Mediterranean and West Africa. This trans Saharan trade stimulated the rise of several sort of kingdoms and empires in that area, with wealth and size and influence enough to rival those which were already dominant in Europe. The richest of these in West Africa had sort of ample stores of gold, lots of trade, and things like that. In the 14th and 15th century, this region was dominated by the kingdom of Mali. This civilization imported things like brass, copper, cloth, spices, Arabian horses, and other kind of manufactured goods from the Far East as well as the Middle East. And the exports that they sent over were mainly gold and slaves. As demand for both of these things began to increase, new states also began to emerge in order to take advantage of these opportunities and to challenge the dominance of Mali. This also included the Songhai Empire, which eventually replaced Mali as the dominant force in the area. Just south of the savannah, you have a region of much smaller states. You don't get the sort of grand empires south of the Sahara that you do in northern Africa. And part of the reason for this was that they were largely herders. However, there was an insect there called the tsetse fly, which kept the herders out of the forest. And so the kingdom's civilizations tended to be much smaller in this area. Much further south, you have even smaller groups, chiefdoms really, who eventually combined to create 4 sizable kingdoms by the 15th century, with Congo being the most powerful as well as the most highly centralized of all of these. Political leaders in these African states differed in the amounts of power that they wielded. Some enjoyed almost godlike status, others depended on their ability to persuade and satisfy their people. They relied very heavily on networks of kinship and extended families, much like civilizations in the Americas relied on those same factors. They tended to view marriage in these African kingdoms as a way to forge alliances with other family groups. Prospective husbands might make a payment to the wife's family, almost like sort of posting a bounty for good behavior, if you like. Wives also maintained lifelong ties to their own families, and children usually tended to plot their ancestry through their mother's line, which tended to give women a fair degree of status and power. The mortality rate was relatively high, and so that tended to be the driving force behind marriages, and also placed a very high premium on children, healthy children who actually survived into adulthood. Men would marry numerous wives, usually beginning at very young ages, in order to have the most children they possibly could, because more children equaled more power and more status. Many depended on farming, which was done by both men and women, for food, and the abundance of land compared to the population enabled them to rotate their crops frequently, unlike Europeans, and so they were able to produce fairly high yields consistently. They practiced sort of slash and burn tactics, much like the Native Americans did, and by the 15th century, market economies had begun springing up amongst these groups. These were stimulated by long-distance trade, and that prosperity extended even into smaller family groups. They would usually trade surplus crops at marketplaces for other foods, cloths, other goods. Religion also played a very big part in everyday life. Like most, Africans believed that there was some kind of world beyond that was rarely glimpsed by the living, but that people would pass to after they died. The nature of that world varied greatly from Europeans, generally speaking, at least the sort of authentic native African religions. The deities would speak to priests through things like dreams, or speaking shrines, or through magical charms. Like Europeans and Native Americans, Africans also explained misfortune in terms of witchcraft and other practices like that. But they differed on one major characteristic, and that was the emphasis on ancestor worship, with your ancestors being sort of spiritual guardians, which is much more like kind of ancient Chinese religion rather than European or even Native American. Artistic traditions were also steeped in religion. Sculptures were used in religious ceremonies, and there was also a kind of moralistic streak which ran through their folk tales. They were often told through sort of dramatic public performances as sort of plays, and were intended to teach a lesson of some sort. Islam began to appeal to many, especially if they had trade relationships with those in North Africa and the Middle East, largely because it was a kind of unifying factor between trading partners, and so they would adopt Islam. But you do see in the sort of African practice of Islam some modifications in order to retain some of the more traditional religious practices. By 1400, Islam was only just beginning to take hold among the common people. Among merchants and kings and emperors, Islam was essentially a business decision, the sort of taking on of that religion, like I say, in order to create a closer sort of trading tie with your trade partners. And it just sort of slowly seeped down into the common people. And like I say, that by 1400, it was starting to take hold among common people. Those that traded mostly on the western coast of Africa, who did trade with the Portuguese and things like that, tended to take on Catholicism as their religious affiliation, again, because of this hope of creating some kind of tie to their trading partners in that way. And so religion played a huge role in that. When Columbus made his voyage, Europe was going through a period known as the Renaissance. Scholars had rediscovered ancient texts on things like philosophy and science and medicine and geography and various other subjects from the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome, which had thankfully been preserved by Muslim and Eastern Orthodox and Jewish scholars in the area. What Christian European scholars hoped to do was to try and reconcile all of this ancient knowledge with their own sort of Christian dogma. This era is characterized by an intense sort of artistic creativity, but society was also gripped by a certain amount of tension during the Renaissance. Creativity inspired by social and spiritual stress, and was looking for stability by glorifying order and hierarchy both in the universe and in their society. For example, things like gender, age, social class, all were used to define your status as an individual. But order actually, as you sort of dug deeper, sort of beneath the veneer of social order, was actually a little bit shaky. Conflicts arose between states regularly, between religions, as the Renaissance is also the period in which the Protestant Reformation takes hold. But you also see conflicts between social classes, or you get peasants' revolts and things like that. And so the foundations of Renaissance order was a little bit unsteady. These conflicts were ultimately rooted in change. National monarchs were consolidating their power, usually at the expense of the church and nobility, and then were cultivating links to powerful merchants for financial support, merchants who were becoming very quickly the leaders of society as opposed to the sort of older nobility. About 75% of the population in Europe were peasants, and so revolts were fairly frequent. Peasant revolts were fairly frequent. However, they were usually quite mercilessly suppressed. Conditions were often made worse for these sort of people in the lower rungs of the population because the population of Europe was growing quite sharply. They tended to utilize commons, or sort of common areas, for growing crops and grazing livestock, but a premium existed on the land, and it sees a lot of landlords seeking to enclose the commons or fence it off so it's not for common use anymore, it's now for the use of the landlord instead. Adding to this, you have what became known as the Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century and made farming increasingly difficult, so that malnutrition and hunger were widespread problems. The growing populations, though, despite malnutrition and hunger, the growth of the population also encouraged things like deforestation in order to supply fuel for housing, for heating homes, and also fuel for building homes, supplies for building homes. This also encouraged the disappearance of important food sources, traditional food sources, which further exacerbated the problems of malnutrition and hunger. Pressures also encouraged the migration of individuals from the countryside to towns. However, most remained at the bottom of the social order, even in town, becoming servants or laborers. And so it was a rather difficult time to be considered a peasant in Europe. The consequences of rapid population growth were particularly acute in England, where, by nature of being an island, land was relatively scarce to begin with. Prices rose and wages fell during the 16th and 17th centuries, which widened the gap between rich and poor. Enclosures aggravated employment, forcing people to sort of wander the countryside in order to find work. The comfortably well-off upper and middle classes saw these kind of wanderers as vagrants and a threat to law and order, and so Parliament responded to this by ordering them whipped and sent home, but this didn't really address the problem because a lot of those people didn't have a home in which to go. And so government, as well as those upper and middle class individuals who were usually involved in government in some way or another, began to see the existence of overseas colonies as a place for the surplus population to go. Traditional European society also rested on maintaining long-term reciprocal relationships. The upper classes acted with restraint, and the lower classes respected their betters as a kind of exchange. Economic regulation that demanded things like no purchaser could pay more than a just price and the seller could make a reasonable profit existed as a kind of unwritten rule for the function of society. But these ideals had been under attack for centuries, and people have been compromising on these ideals for that long. For example, the motto of one group of Italian merchants was "in the name of God and profit," which is somewhat ironic, given at least some of the tenets of the Christian faith. But the fact that making money was right up there with glorifying God is significant towards understanding exactly how these two things fit together. And it is also also emblematic of later periods, even well into the 19th century, where you have some correlation between making money and being godly, or being a good Christian, and the idea that if you are impoverished, then you've obviously done something sinful to warrant that kind of punishment. And so the relationship between God and profit, or God and prosperity, is a fairly early relationship to be established. You also see the advent of a new business organization in Europe at this time. It's called the Joint Stock Company, which is a company that builds capital through selling stock to investors, which is actually the kind of basic description of most publicly owned companies in this country today. A new economic outlook began to emerge that insisted that the individual, in fact, owed nothing to one another, or individuals owed nothing to one another other than the money that was necessary to settle a debt. This is basically the definition of capitalism, or the market economy, which rejected all of the traditional demands of reciprocity, the idea of a purchaser paying no more than a just price and a seller making no more than a reasonable profit. Starts to fly out the window as we go through this period. However, those upper middle class individuals held some conflicting attitudes toward economic enterprise and social change. They desired the opportunity that encouraged competition, but they still wanted that traditional deference that was owed to them based on their status under the older system, the sort of reciprocal system. However, this is essentially an attempt to take without giving. The poor, on the other hand, longed for the old values that would restrain what they saw as the unrestrained greed that's now defining their society. Family tended to be the most sensitive barometer of social change in Europe. Nuclear families, meaning parents and children, existed in a kind of strict hierarchy. The husband was the head, and his authority was not questioned. The wife would support her husband, and children were potential laborers, basically, until they could leave and start their own families. The family was also the principal economic unit in society, meaning that most things that the family needed were made by the family themselves. However, that very quickly changes, especially as the market economy begins to take a firmer hold. So, in 1400, Europe is predominantly Christian, but it is also home to significant numbers of Muslims and Jews. And while more often than not they existed peacefully among one another, there is still a fair amount of hatred and violence, which marks their shared history. For example, Christians waged 3 crusades that span 3 centuries against Muslims, both in Europe and in the Middle East. And Muslims in turn retaliated with holy wars, each side labeling the other as infidels and making, essentially building a conflict that would last for even more centuries after that. Eventually, you have ambitious rulers who sort of use these religious conflicts and transform them into wars of conquest. The Ottoman Empire, for example, seized strongholds in southeastern Europe, and the Spanish and Portuguese undertook their reconquest in order to expel the Muslims and Jews that refused to convert out of Spain. With the success of the reconquest, the Catholic Church was now the dominant force in Western Europe, and taught that grace flowed to sinners through the sacraments, which were administered by priests. The Church also, as we move into the 14th century, begins granting extra blessings or indulgences to repentant sinners, usually for a price, and usually that price was monetary. They would promise the cancellation of penance and even reduction of time in purgatory after you died if you would pay a small price now, or a not so small price, as it may be now. This sale of indulgences ultimately provoked charges of materialism and corruption, which sort of came to a climax in 1517 when a German monk by the name of Martin Luther openly attacked the practice. When he was censured, he broadened his criticism, and this resulted ultimately in his excommunication, and ultimately also kick-started what becomes known as the Protestant Reformation. Other reformers jump on this bandwagon and follow Luther's example, people like John Calvin and others. The reformers generally shared the belief that people needed to take responsibility for their own spiritual condition and demanded, among other things, that the Bible be translated from Latin into common languages so that common people could read it for themselves, which in England meant English. In other places, it meant the common languages there, German, Flemish, French, and so on and so forth. The invention of the printing press also helped dramatically to spread the new faith. And arguably, it was, in fact, the invention of the printing press that meant that this attempt at Reformation actually succeeded. There had been previous attempts made to reform the Catholic Church in earlier periods, but they had all been very much less successful. However, now with the printing press, you have the ability to reach a much wider audience with your ideas. And so this way, instead of just having people in one particular town or one particular city-state, or one particular nation-state even, hear your message, you can print this message and you can get it disseminated all over the continent and even beyond. And so the ease at which information can now be spread actually, I think, makes this Reformation the one that sticks. The Catholic Church, of course, didn't accept the Reformation lying down and instituted its own counter-Reformation, led by Catholic reformers such as Teresa of Avila, who urged the holy orders to repudiate corruption and lead the renewal through living piously and austerely. The high point of the Counter-Reformation came with the calling of the Council of Trent, which denounced the Protestants but also sought to reform church administration and combat corruption, as well as broadening public participation in religious observances. The Reformation eventually made its way to England, although it was more political in England than religious. Interestingly enough, Henry VIII was a devout Catholic for a large part of his life anyways. And in fact, it was in his earlier days, when the Reformation first broke out, that he wrote an essay defending the Catholic Church against the Protestant reformers. The Pope was so grateful for Henry's support that he gave him the title Defender of the Faith to add to his sort of litany of royal titles. And in fact, the Queen of England today still retains the title Defender of the Faith, even though one could say it's less applicable now that England is in fact a Protestant country rather than a Catholic one. One of Henry's highest, several of Henry's highest advisors were prominent members of the Catholic Church. Sir Thomas More, who eventually became a saint, and actually was eventually made a martyr, also by Henry, served on Henry's Privy Council, at least initially, and his chancellor was, as anyone who knows his story, a man called Cardinal Wolsey, who was obviously also a very high member of the church administration as well. Henry had a love affair with Catherine of Aragon, who was slated to marry his brother. Henry was the second son, and Arthur, by all accounts, was healthy, so Henry didn't really have any expectations of the throne. Quite suddenly, his older brother died of a sickness, I believe. Wanting to retain the alliance between Spain and England, Henry arranges to marry Catherine himself as well. Following his brother, and they were married for more than 20 years, but they had some offspring issues. They only managed to have one surviving child, and it was a daughter named Mary. Catherine had been pregnant numerous times and had given birth even quite a few times, but none of them managed to survive beyond Mary. And that was problematic for Henry. Henry is only the second generation of his line, essentially, on the throne. His father had forcibly taken over the throne from the Plantagenets who held it before him. And as such, Henry's position was a little shaky. And so the need to ensure that his dynasty was taken care of, was secure, was very high on his mind. And the most accepted way of doing this was to have a son, preferably two sons, an heir and a spare, as they called it, ready to take over the throne whenever you die. And after 20 years of marriage, he and Catherine hadn't been able to do that. He applied, however, or following this, for an annulment. He had convinced himself that he had committed a grave sin by marrying his brother's widow, and even had Bible verses to prove it. Cardinal Wolsey was certain that he could get the necessary annulment from the Pope. The annulments had to be applied for much more delicately when it came to weddings between monarchs or princes, rather than for normal individuals. The problem was that the Pope was ready to give the Cardinal Henry's annulment, but then the Spanish went and attacked the Vatican, the Papal State, and took the Pope captive. And being a captive of the Spanish, and being that Catherine of Aragon was from Spain, the Pope refused to grant the annulment. Wolsey lost his status over his failure to get the annulment, and Henry decided that he would take the problem into his own hands by separating off his church. He was influenced by some in his court who ascribed to the actual sort of principles of the Protestant Reformation and who encouraged him in that direction. And so Henry became the head of his own church. He granted himself an annulment and then went on to marry 5 other women, only managing to birth one son who was a rather sickly child. And so ultimately, he didn't really achieve what he had hoped to through this. And arguably, it was his daughters who were much stronger rulers than was his son. Religious differences also divided the country for a century following the initial break. In fact, it sort of goes back and forth between the two, Protestant to Catholic, depending on who the monarch is. In actuality, most of the peasants remained Catholic in the way that they celebrated masses, because that was what they preferred. And most of them were sort of unconcerned with the sort of high troubles of the rest of the country. With the ascension of Elizabeth I, you have something of a turning point, however. Popular support for the Catholic Church was beginning to decline, at least in part because of Mary's rather vigorous defense of the Church before Elizabeth, and it seemed that the people were much more ready and willing to embrace the Protestant Church by the time Elizabeth comes to the throne. She wasn't entirely sure how much anyone would be willing to embrace the Protestant Church, and so she chose to steer more of a middle course. She confirmed the monarch's role as the head of the hierarchy, but gave individual and local parishes latitude to decide their own practices, which worked for almost everyone, except for some of the more radical Protestants, which is where Elizabeth meets some problems. Some radical Calvinists, who were nicknamed Puritans, wanted to further purify the Church of England. They felt that it was still a little bit too Catholic under Elizabeth's reign. Some of them hoped to reform the Church from within, while others, who were known as separatists, withdrew from the Church completely. Their severe self-discipline, moral uprightness, and other features were not particularly attractive to the nobility especially, and to the majority of the poor either. But they did find quite a lot of support from the large and growing middle class. Queen Elizabeth distrusted them, but once she was declared a heretic by the Pope, who urged English Catholics to overthrow her, she began courting influential Puritans much more, so swinging much more to that radical side of things. So all of this discussion of Europe and Africa is going to lead us into a discussion of when those countries or those regions sort of end up on a collision course with the rest of the world. And I wanted to draw your attention to this map first and foremost, which is showing, it gives you some kind of visual of just how prolific European explorers were in visiting the rest of the world, and other things like that. So you can see just how much the different countries were looking around and were exploring, in this period. And I want you to keep this in mind as we continue this discussion. So during the 15th and 16th centuries, monarchs and allied merchants organized commercial and imperial ventures to places like Africa and Asia and the Americas. They wanted wealth and power, most of all, but they also claimed a desire to introduce Christianity and to civilize the savages that inhabited those areas already. The two major outcomes of these desires were the Atlantic slave trade and the colonizing of the Americas. This quest for land and labor would ultimately serve to shape the Atlantic world. So Portugal led the way in overcoming the impediments that had long limited long-distance travel. In the 15th century, many advances were made. The addition of the triangular Arab sail made the vessels much easier to sail long distances. They also built much more maneuverable vessels, known as the caravel, which were easier on the high sea. They also mastered the use of things like the compass and the astrolabe in order to better manage far-flung oceanic voyages. Up until this point, they usually only sailed within sight of the coastline, because going too far out means that they would eventually be lost. And so experience with these instruments greatly improved their ability to go further and further afield. Prince Henry of Portugal, nicknamed the Navigator, encouraged Portuguese mariners to capitalize on these new developments, and by the time of his death, the Portuguese were acquiring gold and slaves from as far south as the Gold Coast, and their trade empire was still expanding, Portuguese focusing most of their attention on Africa. In 1488, Diaz reached the southern tip of Africa, and a decade later, Vasco da Gama would lead the fleet around the tip of Africa and on to India in order to establish trade links there. They didn't necessarily destroy the existing commercial links, which went via the Middle East and through the Sahara and places like that, but they did show that there was an alternative and also brought Europeans face to face with West Africans and their already flourishing slave trade in that region. Slavery itself, as a sort of form of economic institution, was well established in Africa in the 15th century, and it took on two basic forms. People would be enslaved because of indebtedness, and usually they were either absorbed into their new families or they were released from bondage once they had worked off their debts. The long-distance commercial trade in slaves was expanding, and while some of those laborers were debtors, a growing number of them were captured in raids or in conflict. Portuguese traders very quickly realized how lucrative the trade could be, and in 1482 they built a major outpost on the Gold Coast, but primarily traded through African-controlled commercial networks. So they essentially just added another link to an existing commercial network. The local kingdoms were too strong to attack at that time, and the rulers traded, or not, usually according to their own interests, and the Portuguese just sort of had to go along with that. West African society was profoundly affected by the Atlantic slave trade, as you would assume. African rulers were enriched with luxuries and with things like guns, which they didn't have access to before. With these new guns, armed raiders could go in and capture even more people to sell as slaves, and the small kingdoms expanded to service the trade, and larger kingdoms, like the Congo, used the trade to expand their already expansive regional power, and adopted things like Catholicism in order to strengthen their ties to the Portuguese traders. Slavery was an old practice, even in Europe, but there were some notable differences in this new slavery that develops. The unprecedented magnitude of the trade resulted in a demographic catastrophe in West Africa. Before the end, nearly 12 million people would be shipped in terrible conditions overseas to entirely new regions. Africans were subjected to new extremes in dehumanization. Previously in Europe and in North and West Africa, most slaves would live in their master's households. They performed domestic duties, but generally they weren't seen as unhuman or less human or less worthy of personhood. But by 1450, the Spanish and Portuguese had created massive plantations where slaves would toil basically until they died in very harsh outdoor conditions. In short, they became property rather than people, and had a very low social standing as a result of that. Race became the ideological basis for this new form of slavery. Their differences, their blackness, along with their alien religion and culture, dehumanized them to the Europeans who purchased them, and as racial prejudice hardened, enslaving blacks became a recognized part of their Christian duty. Very few attempts were made to soften the rigors of slavery, and race was the defining characteristic of a slave, making slavery a lifelong and hereditary and much despised status. So essentially you have the transition from someone who essentially sells themselves to pay off a debt, and once that debt is paid, they regain their freedom, to someone who is sold without their consent and are perpetually left in a situation that is completely intolerable. So, the ultimate goal in all of this travel was to reach Asia and the markets in the Far East. And Columbus concluded that Europeans could reach Asia much more directly by sailing westward across the Atlantic. than by the currently established routes, either overland through the Middle East or by sailing around Africa. Like most educated or seafaring men, Columbus knew that the earth was round. That's a commonly held myth, that he was out to prove that the world was flat, or that people didn't believe him when he said the world was flat. But he vastly underestimated its size, which is interesting, considering that the ancient Greeks fairly accurately managed to calculate its size based on their own mathematical philosophies. He began, however, with this idea that you'd be able to reach Asia much more easily by sailing west, and started looking for patronage. He started in Portugal, because Portugal were the sort of leaders of sea exploration. And John II was king here, and he was interested until the Portuguese sailor Dias reached the Cape of Africa. And so Columbus was not entertained anymore, and he turned his attention to Spain, who ultimately accepted his offer. He managed to reach an island which was called Guanahani by the natives within a month of his journey, actually a rather easy journey, and explored the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, as he called them, where he discovered gold. He then returned to Spain in order to share his discovery. On his second voyage, he founded a colony, but he proved to be rather poor administrator, and after 2 more voyages, he died a rather embittered man. Columbus became ultimately the first slave trader in America and the first conquistador. He forced the native peoples of Hispaniola to mine gold and to supply the Spanish with food, while the Spanish proceeded to bicker amongst themselves. Once the crown took over management of the colony, they extended the search for gold to other parts of the region. In an effort to forestall competition, Spain and Portugal signed a treaty, which was negotiated through the Pope at the time, and became known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic and divided all future discoveries between the two, with Spain getting things on the western side of that line and Portugal getting everything on the eastern side of that line. Actually, the line worked perfectly well. The Portuguese didn't really do much exploration in the New World, save for the very easternmost edge, which is now Brazil. The Portuguese were far more interested in Africa, and so it worked out very well for them, with the Spanish gaining control of most of the New World. The English, however, completely disregarded this treaty and sought to join the race when Henry VII, who was Henry VIII's father, sent explorer John Cabot to explore the North Atlantic, past Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and claimed everything in that region for England. However, it would take England another 60 years to follow up on that claim. The more they explored, the more they came to realize that there was in fact a vast landmass which blocked the route to Asia, and getting past it was still the primary aim for most early explorers. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa came upon the Pacific Ocean after crossing Panama, and in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the tip of South America and across the Pacific, but died fighting local natives in the Philippines, so didn't actually make it back to Europe. The natives on the first Spanish colonies in the Caribbean died off at a remarkable rate from various imported diseases, and to replace them, colonists in those regions began importing Africans. Others went even further afield to find native slaves and gold. In 1519, Hernan Cortez led 600 troops to the Mexican coast and enlisted the support of enemies and discontented subjects of the Aztecs in order to conquer that empire. Upon reaching the capital, the Spanish were stunned by its size and wealth, yet they rejected the emperor's offers, and instead raided his palace and treasury. The Aztecs regrouped and drove the Spanish from the capital, but smallpox ultimately struck. causing an epidemic and wiped out both friend and foe in the city. The Spanish were then able to consolidate their control over central Mexico with the Aztecs out of the way, and by 1521, the Aztecs had been completely overthrown, and the Spanish began building their own city, which became known as Mexico City. Over the remainder of the 16th century, the Spanish built a vast empire which stretched from Mexico to Chile, one of the most important conquests being that of the Inca, where, again, aided by disease, the natives' unfamiliarity with European customs and weapons made it relatively easy for the Spanish to overthrow the vast empire with a relatively small army. The population of the Western Hemisphere shrunk dramatically following the Spanish invasion, from about 13 to 25 million at the beginning to only around 700,000 by this time, which is only really the midpoint. So emerging in the Atlantic world is a linkage between people, but also a linkage between animals and plants and germs and what becomes known as the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus. After 1492, a vast number of Native Americans died, usually because they lacked the antibodies that would resist infectious diseases that were brought from the east, with smallpox being the most deadly. Whole villages would perish at once, and such devastation facilitated European colonization in the Americas, whether it was accompanied by military force or not. These biological encounters affected the everyday lives of people throughout the Atlantic world. But besides disease, Europeans also introduced new animals to their ecosystems, including horses and cattle and sheep and other useful animals. But this also tended to include a fair amount of insects and rodents, which were less useful. They also introduced plants, wheat and other grains, coffee, sugar, various fruits and vegetables, but they also tended to bring over weeds, which wreaked havoc on native ecosystems as well. The Africans brought over rice and yams to plant in American colonies, and the Americans sent back to Europe and Africa things like corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, chocolate, and a whole host of other products. European weeds and domestic animals, and unwanted animals like rats, also drastically altered American environments and the way that Americans lived their lives. Livestock, for example, devoured indigenous plants, which enabled the much more hardy European weeds to take root and take over. As a result, wild animals tended to stay away, which deprived the natives of their traditional food source. Livestock invaded cornfields, settlers' crops were intensively cultivated, which served to exhaust the soil, and so production faded as well. Also, as part of this exchange, you have a mixing of people. 90% of Spanish settlers in the 16th century were male, and if they wanted to marry, yet still stay in the colonies, they tended to marry native women, which gave rise to a large sort of mixed population of mestizos. Throughout the Americas, especially in plantation colonies, there was a growing population of mulattoes, resulting frequently from owners' relations with female slaves, whether voluntary or not. Attitudes toward interracial unions and the children that resulted from them also differed significantly among different colonial societies. Spain acquired seemingly endless wealth from the Americas, gold, sugar, but also huge quantities of silver and other precious metals. However, the Spanish kings were not terribly good with their money, and they squandered that wealth on various European wars, and so needed even more wealth and went bankrupt several times, actually. Their attempts to squeeze more taxes out of their subjects also led to revolt in provinces such as the Netherlands. So the vast majority of European immigrants in the 16th century went to places like Mexico or the Caribbean or South America, but there were still some that went to North America. The majority of attempts at colonies in North America failed because they were predicated on some unrealistic expectations of fabulous wealth and easily conquered natives. After 1600, the decline of native populations from things like disease and the rise of English, French, and Dutch power, corresponding to the fall in Spanish power, made colonization possible in the North American area. In 1614, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands had colonies, and each had its now economic orientation, or each had its own, rather, economic orientation and its own approach to dealing with Native Americans. Encouraged by discoveries further south, one Spaniard, Juan Ponce de Leon, explored the coast of Florida in 1513 and founded a colony there later in 1521. Between 1539 and 1543, Hernando de Soto also led a party through the southern portion of North America, sort of angering native tribes all along the way. In 1540, a coalition of tribes gathered together in order to confront him, and although the Spanish were victorious militarily, their losses doomed them, and the expedition floundered thereafter. Expeditions did serve to spread epidemics, though, that destroyed most of the remaining Mississippian culture. After these and other failed ventures, Spain's principal interest remained in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. They focused more on establishing strategic bases in order to keep the French and the English at bay, but not in sort of massive colonization efforts. In 1565, St. Augustine in Florida also served as a base for Catholic missionaries, hoping to push further north, but they were relatively unsuccessful. In the 1580s, Spanish missionaries began looking toward the southwest and scouting for potential wealth there. In 1598, Juan de Nate led 500 colonists into the upper Rio Grande Valley, proclaiming the royal colony of New Mexico. And despite considerable resistance, managed to impose encomiendas on the native populations. However, the colony was not terribly successful. By 1606, the Spanish replaced Oñate for mismanagement and excessive brutality, and even considered withdrawing altogether. France sent actually an Italian explorer, Giovanni de Verrazzano, in 1524 to try and find a northwest passage to the Pacific. In 1534 and in 1535 and 36, Jacques Cartier also explored the area around the Canadian coast and sailed up the St. Lawrence River. Neither, however, was successful in finding gold or a northwest passage to the Pacific. The first colonizing attempt made by the French in 1541 came when Cartier returned to the St. Lawrence Valley. The natives there were distrustful of him because of his previous visit, and the French abandoned the colony after only 2 years of heavy losses and harsh winters. Some French Huguenots came in 1562 looking for religious freedom and attempted to settle in Florida. They established Fort Caroline, but the Spanish destroyed the fortress a year later, and that, coupled with religious war in France, hindered any further French colonizing efforts. The French and other Europeans had fishermen working off the coast of Newfoundland, and some would barter with local tribes for things like beaver skins. Eventually, the demand in Europe for beaver hats grew and ignited what became the French-dominated fur trade in North America. Unlike other European colonists, the fur traders recognized the importance of reciprocity with the natives and were much more successful than other colonization attempts. Recognizing the value of the Canadian trade, the French government sent Samuel de Champlain to establish a colony in New France at Quebec in 1608, and he made an alliance with certain native tribes there. The Huron alliance provided the French with beaver pelts, while the natives also got European goods and armed protection from their rivals, the Iroquois, who were conveniently allied with France's main rival, the English. England was still a relatively minor power in 1558 when Elizabeth I came to the throne, and she adopted a very militantly anti-Spanish foreign policy, with English Protestants hailing England as an elect nation to elevate true Christianity and overthrow Catholicism. The English had two main objectives, really, in the Western Hemisphere later in the 1570s, The first of these was to find a Northwest Passage and any gold that they managed to find along the way, but this really only led to embarrassment and foolishness. The second of these objectives was to sack Spanish fleets and ports, and that proved to be much more profitable. England and Spain frequently sought to outmaneuver each other in North America. In 1572, Spain tried to fortify a mission on the Chesapeake Bay, but failed, and Sir Walter Raleigh obtained a charter to start a colony further south, closer to Spain, or rather to Spanish territory, choosing the island of Roanoke as the home for that. In 1585, the colony was founded, and at first everything seemed to be going well. But by the winter, the colonists had annoyed the natives with their constant demands for food and eventually killed them all when they began to fear an attack. So that by the time Raleigh returned, the starving colonists were all dead. In 1587, Raleigh sent a second group of colonists to Roanoke, but when the leaders sent for supplies, Raleigh was unable to respond because by that time war had broken out between England and Spain, the famed Spanish Armada, and so Raleigh couldn't get a ship out to the colonists until 1590. By that time, the colonists had disappeared, and their exact fate still remains unknown. While Roanoke was suffering, England managed to win a major battle with the failed invasion of the Spanish Armada, and so managed to assert itself as a major power in the Atlantic. So that by the time James I becomes king and signs a truce with Spain in 1604, both view the Dutch as the greater threat to their prosperity. Spain, as a sort of gesture of good faith, renounced any claim to Virginia and left it open for the English. James issued overlapping grants to the Virginia Company of Plymouth and the Virginia Company of London, and both groups sent colonists in 1607. The Plymouth Company returned to England in failure, but the London Company was successful. However, they nearly suffered the exact same fate. The expedition of the London Company included a lot of gentlemen who thought themselves above things like manual labor and expected the natives to feed them and for riches to just fall into their laps. This obviously didn't happen when they got here. And by December, they were running out of food and running short of friends as well. One member of the expedition, Captain John Smith, led soldiers in an attempt to seize corn from the Powhatan tribe, and they eventually agreed to share their remaining supplies. The Powhatans were also hoping to survive the winter, and so were a little reluctant to share, but felt themselves at, well, not so much of disadvantage, but felt that if they were nice to them now, they might engender friendly relations later. It didn't ultimately work that way. More colonists arrived the next year in 1608, but the settlers were dying inexplicably and in large numbers. Smith managed to figure out that the natives in the region yearly would plant their crops along the James River and just leave them and go further inland. And then in the fall, they would come back and harvest. And so the colonists followed suit. After doing that, only about 12 out of the 200 colonists died that winter. The reason for this is that the James River was basically a giant marsh, and dysentery was the main problem, and it had to do with the quality of the water in summertime. However, once Smith left, the colony discipline broke down and the diseases turned, and Jamestown was yet again in dire straits. New recruits and renewed military rule enabled the colony's recovery, but it didn't actually produce anything of value to the stockholders, which fronted the funds. Eventually, in 1619, tobacco emerged and it commanded high prices on the new European market. And in order to attract labor, the company began awarding 50-acre head rights to whoever would pay passage, allowing enterprising planters to accumulate huge tracts of land if they brought over laborers to work it. Those laborers would remain indentured servants for a fixed term, usually somewhere between 4 and 7 years, essentially working off their debt that they paid to come to the colony. By 1619 as well, military rule had been abandoned because the colony was now prospering sufficiently. And in that year, they also provided for an elected assembly. But there were 3 serious problems that faced the Virginia colony. The first was that local officials regularly defrauded the shareholders, which sunk the company very far into debt. The appallingly high death rate, despite massive immigration, and the requisition for about 6 months' worth of what it was called seasoning, which was essentially you would catch every illness there was to be caught. And if you didn't die in that first 6 months, then you would be well enough to live on, essentially building up an immunity. But the fact that most people didn't survive that seasoning period was obviously problematic. Relations with the natives also steadily declined after the death of Powhatan and Pocahontas, his daughter, and fighting broke out, which resulted in even more colonist deaths, so that by 1625, the English had managed to effectively win the war, but the clash left the company bankrupt. And so James revoked their charter, and Virginia became a royal colony thereafter. In 1620, the Virginia Company of London gave a charter to merchants headed by Thomas Weston, and he in turn sent 24 families of Puritans on a ship called the Mayflower. The leaders and about half the members were separatist Puritans, meaning that they wanted to leave the Church of England because it was too Catholic. They had originally left the church and the country and went to the Netherlands, but unhappy there, they eventually returned to England, made the deal with Thomas Weston in order to come to America. In November of 1620, they landed in what they named Plymouth Bay, just north of the actual land that was granted to them. Knowing that they had actually no legal right to be where they were, the leaders insisted that all male members sign what became known as the Mayflower Compact, which created a civic, body politic government and formally established the Plymouth colony. They were, however, quite unprepared for the winter that struck in that area of North America, and half the colonists died within the first 4 months. Those that were still alive owed much to the aid of English-speaking natives in the region. In order to prevent them from stealing natives' food, the native allies of the Puritans showed them how to grow corn using fish for fertilizer and other tips and tricks for surviving on their own. The first harvest was marked by a massive celebration which lasted for 3 days. However, after this, relations very quickly worsened. News of the Powhatan attack in 1622 hastened the militarization of the Plymouth colony and offended the tribes in that region, which had been nothing but friendly. They became economically self-sufficient and prosperous, and as such, the farmers produced surpluses, which they traded, and within a decade managed to buy out their London backers so that they now own the colony themselves. It also meant that they didn't need to rely quite as heavily on their native allies as they did before, and so relations with natives went downhill after that as well. The Plymouth colony became a significant outpost for Puritans who wished to leave the Church of England. The Dutch also had some movement in the North American territories, representing the newly independent Dutch Republic, a man called Henry Hudson sailed up the river, which bears his name, and traded with Native Americans there, claiming the land for the Netherlands. In 1614, they built Fort Nassau, which is now Albany, and established the colony of New Netherlands. In 1626, the Dutch settled on an island at the mouth of the Hudson and named it New Amsterdam. The earliest colonists lived by the fur trade and relied quite heavily on the Five Nations of the Iroquois as clients as well as military allies, in much the same way that the French relied very heavily on their alliance with the Huron as clients and allies. And that concludes our discussion of Chapter 2. In Chapter 3, we'll look a little bit more closely at the sort of personality and the nature of the different colonies in the North American region, ultimately what become all the English colonies in the North American region.